Curve and swoosh, fashion in the feminine figure. If we start with a generic figure of a young woman, the basic fashion design is to exaggerate the features that make her feminine, the hips. The shoulders and the hips are structured out to create what is called the hourglass. In fashion, this began very early with two motives. The first was to support the bust, the second was to give room to the hips and keep the legs warm. Wool dresses that laced up were extremely good at support and warmth. The neckline and hips were often exaggerated to create a figure very different from the male, which usually been an inverted triangle shape. Mary II to Anne. After the Tudors and the Civil Wars, fashion settled out of the ruffs and the lace collars into a wide neckline and hips with a waist exaggerated by a long pair of bodies and the cut of the dress bodice. William and Mary had brought stability to England. The Netherlands and France was in its Baroque era with the Sun King. German states were recovering from the 30 Years' War, and most of Europe was now resigned to Protestantism. Among the wealthy trade brought in silks and laces, but decoration was still less exaggerated. The exaggerated waist was an elongated optical illusion. Young women would have thin waists, but older women relied on the optical illusion. This had been going on for some time, with the farthingale holding out the skirts and the supporting garment called a pair of bodies worn over the shift to both support the bust and also create a long front over the stomach, giving the illusion of the long waist. The dresses were also exaggerated with gathered fabrics at the hips. Gradually, the body shortened and the panniers made the hips more exaggerated for the classic 18th century look. Before that change, fashion for women took a radical shift in the late 1670s into a skirt straight in the front and heavily padded out in the back, often with a train. The hair was piled high, often decorated with combs or mantillas. Lace and heavily decorated fabrics became more prevalent, and the bodice, called a mantua, was often a separate piece with a peplum that cascaded down the back of the skirts. This fashion only lasted a few years, with the new century bringing in the wider neckline and the hourglass form again. The front hourglass shape, so popular with women's fashion, with the wide neck and the padded hips emphasizing the waist, taking a turn to the side in the S curve with the padded or draped train, and often the high and exaggerated bust, is a look repeated in fashion several times. Charlotte. In the middle of the 18th century, the upper classes were dressing like cupcakes, packing all the lace and trim onto huge dresses over wide panniers. The rest of women were dressed more moderately, with long stays and exaggerated hips. Towards 1780, fashion began to change with the English gown that added a lot of fabric on the back of the hips. The front was pushed out, stuffed with lace or fichus and flowers. Fabrics became lighter and less decorated, and the light muslin dress became more popular, sometimes without the visible outer corset, sometimes with it cut low to push out the bust. The English gown became narrower through the hips and then cut away to expose a very flat front with a prow-like bust. The waist drew higher, but the corset jacket stayed as bust support until it disappeared. Women now depended on the high stays for support, the dress usually held in place with a sash. The silhouette was high, prominent bust, a flat front, and a rear that was flowing with the pleated and gathered fabric from the high waist into trains. Even the outerwear reflected this silhouette. By the turn of the century, high headdresses crowned the affair, looking very similar to 1690, 100 years earlier. Victoria. By 1830, the waist was lowering and emphasis moved away from the bust and back to the wide skirt with exaggerated shoulders. The puff sleeves gave way, but the skirts grew wider and wider, forced out by masses of starched and ruffled petticoats to exaggerate the waist. The invention of the crinoline in the 1850s relieved women of the massive petticoats, but allowed the skirts to grow to immense volume. The sleeves were also heavy at the bottom, throwing emphasis on the fragile torso above the bell-like bottom. Most women wore a more moderate crinoline, but added ruffles to the skirts to make them even wider. By 1860, the crinoline was exaggerated to the point where the fabric for the skirts was over 15 meters. Women swapped out bodices to allay the costs of the huge skirts. As before, the crinoline was like a farthingale that was lighter and stronger. It collapsed, which helped with sitting, but was very difficult to dress. Bust support continued with the newer corsets, some hooking to the front while still lacing in the back. This undergarment was wonderful for women who had a larger bust that was easier to lift than to drag with straps. It was designed to hold the waist snugly while allowing for the hips and the stomach, supporting the bust with a very long line through the entire rib cage. As with any fashion, the look depended on the women wearing it. The fashion of this time was for a full-figured woman. The corset pushed up, but the flesh sometimes pushed up over the corset and gave the effect of being squished rather than the majestic prow of a chest. The women looked ridiculous in this fashion. Thin women looked ridiculous in this fashion. Some women could achieve a nice look with a looser blouse and skirt. Others could rely on padding and ruffles. As with today, having the right corset that fit correctly make or broke the look. Only teenagers could do the exaggerated waist to the point where it was unbelievable. By 1865, the crinoline became elongated in the back with a shift in style. The bodice didn't change much, but the emphasis was moving the skirts to the back from the sides and the front. Soon the back was being decorated with folds of fabric, and the jacket top was reminiscent of the English gown with a fitted top and flowing tails. By 1870, the shift was complete from the hourglass to the swoosh, with more emphasis on the bust and the huge emphasis on the flowing back skirts, often held up by a bustle. Even when the natural form came in between the bustle periods, the S-curve was pronounced, now with a train, again looking very like the same fashion 200 years before. Again, the hair was dressed high with flowing curls down the back to mimic the skirts. Elizabeth II. In the 20th century, after World War II, fashion again shifted to the full-figured woman, with emphasis on the wide skirts and the wide neckline to create the hourglass illusion of a curvy bust, large hips, and a small waist. The thin models of this era had to pad out the bust or wear collars and gathers to achieve the look. The skirts were held out, usually with tulle petticoats and heavy fabric cut into circle skirts. The bodice was usually form-fitting with details around the wide neck. Sometimes, rather than tulle, the wide skirt was over a crinoline. The idea was similar, but the materials were different. The same with the long-line bra and the girdle, all made of rubber, boning, and heavy cotton, silk, and lace. The undergarments for larger women came with multiple panels to hold in the stomach. It is in the bridal fashion and evening wear that we can really see the similarity to Victorian mid-century fashion. The skirts making that waist and bodice seem smaller and delicate, with the bust putted out with fur, flowers, fabric, or even feathers. Designers had fun with the colored tools, some creating elaborate designs from the fabric alone. Deeper into the 50s, even as the wide skirt persisted, fabric was being drawn back. The rival fashion was the pencil skirt and the sweater, both created for a woman whose body was already hourglass. But the designers were having fun with a new silhouette where the skirts were pulled to the back, some with trains. Some played with the front and the back with structured fabrics, while others celebrated the bustle look with gathered skirts, cutaways, elaborately draped fabrics, ruffles and lace, patterned tools, or cuts that combined the pencil skirt and the bustle in styles reminiscent of the 1880s. Only the hair was different, designers preferring the slicked-backed hair that didn't detract from the dress. One of the designers at the time was the peplum, sometimes quite prominent as if another skirt, sometimes following the form. The peplum often emphasized the back, gathered there like a mini bustle, and sometimes the hips like a mini crinoline. From the front, the new look was very much 1880s, evening wear carrying this to extreme, and the daytime suit following the flat front of the girdle, the prow-like chest, and the little kick in the back and the hips.